The morning arrives like an ordinary one, but Fatima knows better. It is 1687, deep within the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. She is 17 years old, though she no longer speaks this number aloud. Her birth name was Fatima Çiçek, daughter of a merchant in Ankara. But that woman ceased to exist on the day her father died, and her mother sold her to a talent scout for the Sultan's household. That was 8 months ago. The name on her official papers now is simply Huma, meaning bird of paradise, a name chosen by someone she has never met in a language of transformation that strips away the girl she was. The sound of the fountain in the courtyard outside her small chamber echoes through the stone walls. Water. Always water. Flowing, constant, never stopping. Just like the rhythms of life inside these walls that have consumed her. She sits on a cushioned bench, her body still wrapped in the white linen wrap that marks her as a newly inducted odalisque, a concubine in waiting. Her hands are henna-stained from yesterday's ritual bathing, the dark orange-red pigment staining her palms and fingertips like dried blood. She has not yet been called. Not yet. Through the narrow window high above her head, sunlight cuts a sharp line across the stone floor. It reaches only halfway across the room. The rest remains in shadow. She watches dust particles move through that line of light, and for a moment, just a moment, she wonders if her mother can see this same sun from Ankara. The thought arrives unbidden and is immediately dangerous. Attachment to the outside world is forbidden. She has already been warned twice by the older concubines. Thoughts of home make you visible. Visible means noticed. Noticed means chosen. The bell rings. Not the morning bell, not the prayer bell, the selection bell. Her stomach tightens. A eunuch's voice calls names from the corridor outside. Not her new name, but the others. 3 girls. She listens as their footsteps shuffle past her door. The girl in the chamber next to hers, Layla, whispers something that sounds like a prayer. Fatima does not move. She keeps her breathing shallow. She touches the small bruise on her left shoulder from the inspection yesterday, and she understands, with the cold clarity that comes only to the powerless, that something fundamental has begun. She is now waiting for her turn. This is not the story of a single tragedy. It is the story of a system, a machine, built by law and tradition and theology, that took the bodies and lives of thousands of young women and fed them into an apparatus designed to serve the absolute power of the Ottoman Sultan. What happened to Fatima, and was happening at that very moment to dozens like her in the chambers around her, was not random cruelty. It was policy. It was architecture. It was mathematics. It was, to those who built and maintained it, completely logical. In the centuries that followed, this system would be forgotten, romanticized, or explained away. Tourists would walk through the restored rooms of Topkapi Palace and marvel at the glazed tiles and the intricate fountains, and would have no sense whatsoever of the terror that lived in those spaces. But the terror was there. It lived in the silence. It lived in the rules. It lived in the eyes of girls like Fatima Çiçek, who vanished from the world entirely on the day her father's influence ended and her mother's desperation began. Before we follow Fatima deeper into this story, before we understand what happened to her in the months and years that followed, you need to understand something essential. This is not mythology. This is not speculation. This is not a dramatic reconstruction invented for entertainment. The Ottoman Harem system and the violence embedded within it is one of the most thoroughly documented structures of organized sexual exploitation in recorded history. The sources are everywhere, if you know where to look. The Ottoman court maintained meticulous records. Detailed lists exist of every girl who entered the palace, their origins, their assigned names, their daily allowances, and in many cases, their fates. Palace officials wrote long administrative reports, some of which have survived in the archives of the Topkapi Palace itself, describing the regulations governing concubines, the punishments for disobedience, and the procedures by which girls were selected, trained, and presented to the sultan. These are not hidden documents. They sit in Turkish archives today, read by historians, analyzed by scholars, and largely ignored by the public. Beyond the official records, we have the accounts of travelers. Diplomats from Venice, France, England, and Austria spent time in Constantinople and left behind detailed observations about life inside and around the palace. They describe what they witnessed, what they were told, what they understood about how the system actually functioned. Some of these accounts were published as books. Some remain in private collections and letters. Some were suppressed or dismissed as exaggeration for centuries until modern scholars examined them alongside the Ottoman records and realized these observers had been remarkably accurate. We also have the voices of some who escaped or were released. A few women, both Ottoman and foreign-born, wrote or dictated accounts of their time in the harem. These narratives provide something no official record can: the emotional truth, the psychological weight, what it felt like to be inside those walls day after day, knowing that your body was not your own and that resistance was not only futile, but potentially fatal. And finally, there is the archaeological evidence. Topkapi Palace has been partially excavated and carefully restored. The chambers where girls like Fatima slept still stand. The corridors they walked, the courtyards they were permitted to enter, the small, barred windows through which they glimpsed the outside world, all of it remains. When you understand what these spaces were actually used for, the architecture itself becomes a document of control. To understand the Ottoman harem, you must understand that it was not born from random desire or from the casual accumulation of women around a powerful man. It was a deliberate, legal, theologically justified institution designed to serve specific political and dynastic purposes. The apparatus had a name, a hierarchy, rules written in Ottoman administrative documents, budgets allocated by the Imperial treasury, and officials assigned to manage every aspect of it. At the absolute center of this structure was a single question: how does a sultan ensure a supply of legitimate male heirs without sharing power with a wife's family? Before the harem reached its most elaborate form in the 16th and 17th centuries, Ottoman sultans sometimes married women of noble birth. These marriages created political alliances, but also created threats. A wife's family might claim influence. Her relatives might demand positions of power. A widowed wife might become a rival faction. The solution was elegant and brutal: do not marry them. Instead, import young girls of no family, no connections, no political backing. Use them to produce heirs. Keep them isolated. Keep them dependent. Keep them subjugated. The word harem itself comes from the Arabic word for forbidden. It means the women's quarters, the private space where outsiders, particularly men, cannot go. But in the Ottoman palace, the harem became something far more specific. It became a vast institution housing anywhere from several hundred to over 1,000 women at any given time, each with an assigned role, a salary, a rank, and a specific place in an intricate hierarchy. At the top were the concubines who had borne the sultan's sons, the hasekis. Below them were the women with a chance of elevation, the odalisks, girls in their teens and 20s who were essentially waiting. And below them were the older women who had aged out of sexual viability, servants, teachers, and supervisors. The girls came from everywhere within the Ottoman Empire and from beyond it. Some were selected through the devshirme system, an empire-wide recruitment process that would take Christian boys for military service and occasionally take girls for the harem. Others were purchased from slave traders. Still others were literally sold by impoverished families or widowed mothers who could not feed them. The criteria mattered less than the result. Girls with no family power, no network of male relatives to complain about their fate. Girls whose disappearance would not trigger dangerous questions. Once inside, each girl underwent a transformation managed by a specific official, the Kislar Agassi, the chief black eunuch. This man, himself enslaved, himself castrated, held one of the most powerful positions in the Ottoman court. He controlled who entered the harem, who left, who rose in rank, who was punished, and who was discarded. He reported directly to the sultan. Under him was a network of older women, lesser eunuchs, servants, and guards. It was an entire mini-bureaucracy dedicated to managing, transforming, and extracting value from the bodies and lives of thousands of girls. This was justified through Islamic law and through the sultan's absolute authority as the caliph. Religious scholars explain that the sultan, as God's vice-regent on earth, had the right to maintain a harem. The practice, they argued, was not against Islamic principles. It was the sultan's prerogative. And because the sultan did it, because the law permitted it, because God's representatives on earth sanctioned it, there were no grounds for resistance. What occurred in these quarters was not merely legal, it was divinely ordained. What made this apparatus particularly efficient was that it solved multiple problems at once. It eliminated male heirs produced outside marriage, which would create competing claims to the throne. It prevented the sultans themselves from forming emotional attachments that might weaken their judgment. It provided a steady supply of concubines who could be given as gifts to high officials and generals, a form of payment and complicity. And it kept women completely severed from political power, which meant that no woman could ever rule in her own right and challenge the male-centered hierarchy of the empire. Fatima's day begins before sunrise. The bell rings at a time she has learned to recognize by the exact shade of gray outside the window. She has no clock. No one in the harem wears a watch or carries a timepiece, but she has learned to read the light, and the light tells her it is time. She sits up on her narrow bed, a palimpsest of previous occupants, and waits for the next sound. The water comes first. A servant girl, no older than she is, enters without knocking and places a copper vessel on the stone floor. Cold water. It has to be. Heated water is reserved for the sultan's concubines, the ones who have already borne his children. Fatima splashes her face and her arms. She rinses her mouth. Back home in Ankara, her mother used to prepare warm baths after the harvest, with rose petals and warmed herbs. That memory is forbidden. That memory belongs to a girl who no longer exists. Breakfast is in the communal room. Flatbread, some white cheese, dates, and watered wine. 23 other girls sit in rows on cushions. Silence is absolute. The only sound is the soft scrape of teeth on bread and the constant low hum of the fountain in the courtyard outside. One girl, new like Fatima, tries to something to her neighbor. Before she finishes the first word, a supervisor, a heavy woman named Emine, who lost her position as a concubine decades ago, stands and nods toward the door. The girl who spoke doesn't return to breakfast for 3 days. The message is received. The rhythm continues unchanged. After breakfast comes inspection. Fatima and the other new girls line up in the courtyard while an older woman named Zeybi examines them. Zeybi was once beautiful enough to catch the sultan's attention, and she carries that history in the way she moves through the younger girls, as though they are merchandise and she is the merchant. Teeth. skin for spots or blemishes, hair kept shoulder length and oiled, underarms and legs. She is checking for disease, for signs of disorder, for any physical imperfection that might render them undesirable. If something is found, it is marked on a piece of paper. Those girls are moved to different quarters. What happens to them is not explained. There is work. Girls like Fatima spend hours learning needlework, calligraphy, dancing, and how to move properly through a room. These are not skills taught for their own sake or for the girl's education. They are preparation. Fatima is being shaped into an object of aesthetic value. Her hands must be graceful enough to delight, her posture elegant enough to suggest availability, her movements fluid enough to indicate obedience. She sits for hours in a small room with 3 other girls, practicing the same complex knot patterns on silk over and over again. Calluses form on her hands. When she complains quietly, the supervisor reminds her. Pain teaches attention. Attention prevents mistakes. Mistakes end badly. That night, in the darkness of the chamber she shares with 2 other girls, one of them begins to cry. Her name is Layla. She came from the countryside, from a village near the Black Sea. 3 weeks inside these walls. Under her thin blanket, she cries in a way that sounds like drowning in air. The other girl, Aisha, reaches across and takes her hand. No words are exchanged. They cannot speak. The walls are thin. The supervisors listen. But the hand-holding continues until Layla's breathing steadies and she falls into an exhausted sleep. This is what remains of human kindness in this place. Silent gestures, transmitted touch. Fatima thinks, in that moment, that she understands the actual genius of what has been done to them. It is not just the physical confinement. It is not just the rules or the punishments. It is the slow, methodical eradication of anything that makes you recognize yourself in other people. You are not allowed to speak intimately. You are not allowed to keep your own name. You are not allowed to remember your mother. You are not allowed to plan a future. You are not allowed to know what happens to the girls who vanish into the provincial quarters. You are allowed only to exist, exactly as you have been shaped, in the exact role you have been assigned. Everything else is dangerous. Outside, the empire continues. The sultan is governing. Wars are being fought. Scholars are writing. Merchants are trading. Ordinary women in ordinary houses are raising their children and attending to their homes. But inside these chambers, time moves differently. It moves in circles. The same routines repeat. The same rules apply. The same invisible pressure presses down on your chest every single moment of every single day, and you cannot name it, you cannot protest against it, and you cannot escape it. It happens to Fatima on a Thursday evening in late autumn, 8 months after her arrival. She is in the courtyard, practicing the way she has been taught to walk, deliberate, graceful, like a shadow moving across water. The chief eunuch appears. He does not speak to her, he simply nods to the supervisor. That nod means her name has been drawn. That nod means everything has changed. There are rituals for this. First comes the bathing. She is taken to a heated room filled with steam and scent. Women wash her body with precise, clinical efficiency. They do not hurt her. They do not treat her gently. They treat her like an object being prepared for inspection. They remove every trace of hair from her body below the neck. They wash her 3 times. They apply oils imported from across the Mediterranean. One woman, an older Armenian who has been doing this work for 30 years, catches Fatima's eye for just a moment and looks away. That tiny gesture, that refusal to acknowledge her as human, is, in its own way, the most terrifying thing that has happened to her yet. Then comes the clothing. Not the simple cotton wraps she has worn since arriving. a robe of pale silk, embroidered with gold thread that catches the light. It is beautiful. She has never worn anything so beautiful. It makes her feel, for a moment, like a bride. Then she remembers that there is no marriage contract. There will be no husband. There will be only a transaction disguised as divine privilege. The Sultan, she has been told, does not marry concubines. He simply uses them. And using them, in the context of imperial theology, is the highest honor the girls could possibly receive. She walks through corridors she has never been permitted to enter, escorted by the chief eunuch and 2 other male attendants. No other girls are allowed to see her. The invisibility of this moment, the fact that no one will witness what happens, is itself a form of violence. It means there will be no testimony. It means what occurs in these rooms exists outside the realm of official acknowledgement. If she is hurt, no one needs to record it. If she is traumatized, no one needs to document it. If she is broken by what happens, that is not an administrative concern. She enters a room she has never been permitted to imagine. It is vast and perfumed and decorated with gold. A man sits on a cushioned platform. He is the Sultan. He is perhaps 50 years old. She has never been closer to a man than she is now, and he is looking at her the way one looks at a new possession. He gestures. She is to remove her robe. She does. He tells her to approach. She does. What unfolds follows a script she has been taught, but which no one has ever been honest about. This is what they call a coercive sacred union, a moment in which the Sultan exercises his absolute power and his divine right in the same gesture. She cannot consent. She cannot refuse. She can only endure. It is over quickly. He dismisses her with the same gesture that summoned her. She returns to the bathing room, where attendants wash her again, strip the oils away, return her to her chamber in silence. No one speaks to her. No one asks how she is or what happened. On her bed, the same narrow bed she occupied that morning, Fatima understands that her life has entered a new phase. She is no longer a girl in waiting. She is marked. What comes next, she will not be told. Not all girls accept this fate as Fatima does. A girl named Amin, different from the supervisor who bears the same name, refuses to enter the Sultan's chamber. She runs, and before anyone can stop her, she tries to throw herself from a window. She survives the fall. What happens after that? No one knows. She is removed from the harem. The supervisors tell the other girls that she was transferred to a provincial residence. The girls understand what that actually means. It means she will never be seen again. The machinery survives because most girls do not have Emin's courage or her desperation. They internalize the rules. They accept the theology. They understand that resistance is futile and that hope is dangerous. And the apparatus is protected by the simple fact that all of this occurs behind locked doors, in a space where no outside authority has jurisdiction. What happens here is the Sultan's private concern. No one from outside can intervene. No one from outside even knows, really, what is happening. For Fatima, the aftermath of that night is almost worse than the event itself. The other girls begin to treat her differently. Some envy her. Some look at her with a mixture of pity and relief that it was not them. Others simply avoid her eye, because acknowledging her means acknowledging what was done to her, means acknowledging what could be done to them. She is now marked. The mark is invisible to the outside world, but it is unmistakable to everyone within these chambers. She will carry it for as long as she lives. By the time Fatima was selected for the Sultan's chamber, criticism of the harem had been circulating within Ottoman intellectual and religious circles for more than a century. Islamic scholars pointed out that the practice violated certain interpretations of Quranic law. Some argued that concubinage without marriage degraded the women and, by extension, degraded the empire itself. A few brave reformers suggested that the sultan might take a single wife instead and maintain his legitimacy through a more conventional marriage. These arguments fell on deaf ears. The sultans, and the officials who benefited from it, had no interest in reform. Economically, the harem was valuable. Daughters of provincial governors, Christian prisoners of war, and girls from conquered territories generated diplomatic value and served as mechanisms of compliance. When a sultan wanted to reward a general or a bureaucrat, he could gift him one of the concubines, a practice that kept the military and administrative classes loyal and implicated in the institution. To dismantle it would be to lose a crucial tool of imperial governance. In the 18th century, a few sultans did attempt limited reforms. Some reduced the size of the harem slightly. Some wrote new regulations governing the treatment of concubines, mandating that they be given better food or more comfortable housing. These reforms were largely theatrical. A concubine given better housing was still imprisoned, still sexually available to the sultan on demand, still severed from her family and from the outside world. The reforms were designed to make the apparatus appear less brutal without actually changing its fundamental nature. What remained constant throughout all the supposed reform efforts was the complete absence of any serious legal protection for the women involved. There was no mechanism by which a concubine could claim that what was done to her was wrong. There was no court to which she could appeal. The sultan's use of the harem was not merely permitted by law, it was above law, and as long as it remained above law, it was impervious to challenge. By the 19th century, Western diplomats and travelers began writing about the harem with explicit moral condemnation. European newspapers published accounts of the brutality. Ottoman officials, suddenly concerned about their international reputation, began to claim that the practices described in these foreign accounts were exaggerated or false. They pointed to their reforms as evidence that the institution was not as dark as critics suggested. But they did nothing fundamental to dismantle it. The harem continued. Girls continued to be taken. Girls continued to vanish into those chambers. The Ottoman Empire itself finally collapsed in 1922. The new Turkish Republic explicitly banned the practice and executed a series of legal reforms supposedly protecting women. But by then, thousands upon thousands of girls had already passed through those gates. They had been used, broken, and either kept as aging servants within the palace or dismissed into a world they no longer recognized. Some had borne children to sultans and lived in a kind of elevated captivity. Most had simply faded into obscurity, their stories erased from the historical record. For Fatima, no reform would have liberated her. No diplomatic pressure, no theological argument, no legal statute would have changed what happened to her. The institution that had captured her would continue operating long after her death. The men who benefited from it would face no consequences. The structure itself would persist, only gradually becoming less visible as the empire modernized and certain practices became too embarrassing to maintain openly. But the principle that had created it, that the sultan's power was absolute, that women had no autonomy, that the bodies of the powerless existed to serve the desires of the powerful, that principle remained embedded in Ottoman law and culture for centuries. Today, Topkapi Palace is a museum. Thousands of tourists walk through its restored chambers every year. They marvel at the tile work. They photograph the fountains. They read plaques explaining the historical significance of the various rooms. Some of them visit the harem section. They see the narrow chambers where the girls slept. They see the courtyards where they were exercised like animals in a controlled environment. And then they move on to the next gallery, to the next exhibit, to the gift shop to buy a postcard. largely unaware of what actually occurred in these spaces. There are a few plaques that mention the harem's existence. Most are vague, some are sanitized. Few actually communicate the reality of what the harem was. A system of organized, institutionalized sexual exploitation, justified by theology and maintained by law, in which thousands of girls were imprisoned, violated, and psychologically destroyed. The stones remember, but the tourists do not. The architecture bears witness, but the witness is silent. We tell ourselves that this is history, that these were different times, with different standards, different moralities. And technically, this is true, but we should be careful about the comfort this narrative provides. Because the same logic that justified the Ottoman harem, the belief that some people's bodies belong to others, that power gives a right to use the powerless, that the most horrific abuses can be made acceptable through the right combination of law and theology, this logic did not die in 1922. It persists. It appears in systems of human trafficking. It appears in the exploitation of domestic workers. It appears wherever there is a concentration of power unmatched by any legal protection for the vulnerable. The deeper truth is this: civilization is measured not by the grandeur of its monuments, but by how it treats those with no power to resist. The Ottoman Empire built beautiful palaces. They created sophisticated bureaucracies. They advanced mathematics and astronomy and poetry. And they constructed a machine designed to imprison thousands of girls and exploit them until they were no longer useful. Both things are true. Both things are part of the same historical reality. What happened to Fatima happened to thousands of girls whose names we will never know. Some of them bore children who became sultans, and their names appear in history books. Most of them simply ceased to matter. They were consumed by an apparatus and then forgotten by it. No one documented their resistance. No one preserved their testimony. No one made sure that we, centuries later, would remember their faces or their voices or the details of what was taken from them. But we can remember. We can insist on remembering. We can refuse the comfortable myths that turn abyssal cruelty into romance or exoticism. We can look at the places where these atrocities occurred and speak their names aloud. Fatima, Layla, Aisha, Emine, and the hundreds of others whose names were erased. They deserve to be more than a footnote in a history book. They deserve to be recognized as witnesses to what human power, unchecked and unjustified, is capable of doing. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe that the forgotten dead deserve to be remembered, if you believe that uncomfortable truths are more important than comforting myths, then subscribe. Watch the other stories we've uncovered. Share them. Make sure that the next person who visits these ruins, who walks through these chambers, understands what actually happened here. The silence of history is not inevitable. It is a choice, and you can choose differently.